We have our old buddy Nathan Rinne from Concordia St. Paul on with us this week, per the usual arrangement, talking about race relations and how that affects us and what we can do about it, how we should think about it, and whether the country is going to survive and whether or not Christianity is going to survive in America and all those sorts of things. Also, I have a very important announcement about the Kenya Well Project, as well as a new project that we're starting via In Layman's Terms and also through my YouTube channel, Trucker Hacks. And we'll get to all that in due course. This is Matthew Garnett. Welcome to In Layman's Terms.
King Jr. talked about reparations, how he was willing to kind of be merciful and willing to be compassionate and willing to try to bring things about, to bring restitution about in a way that retained the dignity of those whom he was asking for restitution from. And so really a lot of the legislation that happened during the civil rights movement, 1965, the voting thing, the thing about redlining, all of these things, and then plus, the Great Society programs, all of this stuff, these are things that Martin Luther King Jr. saw as going hand in hand with restitution, with reparations even, and he was even willing to include, for example, white veterans who had not been treated as well as they should have by the government. And so he didn't see, and so what happened is reparations and restitution, it became something that benefited the black community, but it also was generous. It was generous to other minorities. It was generous to other people who had been unfairly treated.
Starving children. All right, so like we said, we've got Nathan Rinne on probably for the next couple of weeks. We had a good, very solid, very substantive 2-hour conversation about what's going on. He's from Minneapolis, so he's got, I would guess, some amount of insight and some amount of concern for what's going on, and not very far south of him is Kenosha and Chicago, and so forth. So we're going to have Nathan Rinne for the next couple of weeks, and it was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to you all seeing that. So I want to give time for it, but I also want to explain kind of a shift in what In Layman's Terms and also my YouTube channel, Trucker Hacks, is now doing. The Kenya Well Project is, in my estimation, very well taken care of. They almost have all the money raised for that project. We'll let you know updates on it when it goes in, when it happens. We raised a good chunk of money, but a donor with our partner church came along and donated a bunch of money to it. So God be praised for that. I thought it was gonna be we were in for the long haul on this thing, and I was starting to get worried that it might not happen, but we had a big donor come in and kind of save the day. That's kind of how some of these things happen a lot of times, and it's going to be great when that well goes in, and I'm very thankful to all of you who have contributed to it, and we're a big part of making that happen, and I can't wait to see it come to fruition. I can't wait for the day when Kibo's Hope Academy has that well in place, and they're not having to worry about going outside to go to the bathroom, not worry about having to go outside to gather water so they can have a proper breakfast or lunch, or get a drink of water at the, like most normal school students, at a water fountain. Because once they have that well in there, they're going to be able to have all of that, and it's going to be great. That's the biggest thing about that well, is they're going to be able to have indoor plumbing, something we take for granted here in the United States. You go over to the tap and turn it on and water comes out, and that's what they're going to have, and it's going to be fantastic. So not quite mission accomplished there, but pretty close to it. So I want to shift the focus to an idea I've had that I've been thinking about for many years, which is to start a truck driving school for former inmates. Now, a lot of times, former inmates, the recidivism rate in America is a very, very difficult thing to deal with, because they just kind of seem to be in this cycle of being in and out of prison. And sometimes you can't break that cycle. It's impossible to break, but with certain individuals you can, if you intervene in the right way. And I think teaching former inmates how to drive trucks can be a way out of that, especially if they're willing to do it. Part of the problem with folks who have come out of prison is they just simply can't find a good paying job. They can find, something here and there, that might be menial, but they really can't find a good paying job. And, truck driving pays well. It's just you got to find somebody that's willing to hire you with a criminal record. Now, some companies will do that, but most won't. And so what we're looking to do is not only train these guys, but provide and place them in employment where they can pursue that career, have a good career. Trucking does more than pays the bills. I make good money driving trucks, and what we want to do is teach these guys how to drive trucks, and if they want to, eventually own their own business if they want. That's not that difficult. They just gotta lease and buy a truck from a company, stick with it, and they can do it. So we want to provide that kind of hope here at home. I think it's a great idea, especially in the times we're living in right now. And so we're going to start. If you go to laymanstermsradio.org, you'll see on the splash page there, on the landing page, our GoFundMe that's already set up to donate. And the first step we got to take here, because this is kind of a complicated process, we've got to get a business plan, a pitch put together to potential investors to this idea, and that's really what we're focused on now. It's not as much as the well, thank goodness, for right now. It's only $1,800. I've got another donor who said if I raise the $1,800, that they'll match another $1,800, which will pay for the consultant we need to write a business plan, a pitch that will help us get investors into the project. So that's what we're shooting for right now, $1,800. I've already talked to a couple of you who have recently donated to the well project and asked you if we could transfer those funds over to the truck driving school project. You've been more than gracious to say, yeah, use it however you'd like. I very much appreciate that. I do want to give you fair warning. I have shut down the well project GoFundMe, and if you are giving via PayPal, what I will do is try to contact you and let you know I'm going to try to transfer those funds over to the truck driving school project. Hopefully everybody's going to be cool with that. I will hopefully be setting up a PayPal for this. I'm not sure quite yet, because GoFundMe is cheaper than PayPal. PayPal's easier, GoFundMe's not as easy. But the point being, if you've donated toward the well project and we've got those funds in reserve, we definitely can give them toward the well. The well still needs a little bit more money to be completed, so it's not like it can't go there. But what we would like to do is go ahead and move these funds toward retaining this consultant that's going to get us going in establishing this truck driving school. And so there we are. I think this will be a really great project. I hope you'll contribute to it. We've already, as of now, got somewhere between $200 and $300 raised for it. So we've already got people invested in it even before it started. So we're very excited about that. So it won't take much. It'll just like the wall project, it'll just take all of us together donating a little bit, and we can make it happen pretty rapidly. And I'm excited to see what might happen with this, because I think it's a great idea and can be something that can really serve our community and be a model for perhaps other vocational programs around the country. So that's what we're after now. Anyway, let's not waste any more time, because I want to get to my buddy Nathan Rinne and our talk on race relations, Christianity in the United States. Here we go. We're on my podcast called In Layman's Terms. I think we kind of discussed making that fairly clear. I probably, generally speaking, on my podcast, come across too much as an expert many times, and when I'm not. And that's why I always like to have you on, because you are nice and down to earth, and you ask good questions and help me kind of come back to planet Earth and be a layman on some of this stuff. But we're trying to figure out this race relations idea. I like the piece you put up on your blog theology like a child, where you're trying to wrestle with these terms like systemic racism. So maybe we could start there, because that's been my frustration as of late. And I don't know, you probably remember maybe a month or so ago, I got particularly frustrated because I'd reached out to somebody who said, yeah, they were willing to talk. And then when I started to ask them the tough questions, then all of a sudden they didn't want to talk anymore. And I got really angry about that, because I don't have a ton of time to spend, just trying to get somebody to talk, when initially they said, I'll do anything. I'll talk to anybody. And then you ask them a question like, I don't understand what systemic racism is. I don't point this out to me. This thing is it's just an arthurist, broad term that I can't make any sense out of.
Right.
But I've been told if I deny it that I'm a racist and I don't understand, and it's not their job to educate me, et cetera, et cetera. I get all of that pushback. And they're like, well, go read a book. Go read this book, that book, the other book. Well, I've read all those books. I've read D'Angelo. I've read The Critical Theorist. We did a podcast on critical theory. I've studied these things. And yet I still hear this term systemic racism. And I don't understand I don't know what that term means. I know what it means, but I don't see it in our society today. So, for instance, the way I understand systemic or institutional racism, as they might put it, is Jim Crow laws. That's systemic racism. Okay. You point to that, you show me, hey, see this law right here? See this way the system discriminates against a particular group of people? That's what needs to be changed. Okay. Right. Got it.
Now, Civil rights movement, 1960s. I mean,
100%.
All of that came to a head.
Right. Voting Rights Act, all that stuff. Great stuff. I agree with it 100%. I'm even coming around. Well, I'll make a confession here at first. I used to not like the portion of the civil rights movement that demanded private businesses serve, everybody. You can't discriminate based on race.
Right.
I say that's something the market can take care of, but I'm starting to change my tune on that in the sense that, say, for instance, Amazon, this gigantic company, what if they shut out, what if they said, well, we no longer serve white male Christians?
Right.
Okay, that we might create a fuss about that, because I use Amazon quite a bit. So, and in that vein, for something like Twitter to do what they're doing with their censorship and that sort of thing. So I think that it's reasonable. We've already shown it's reasonable to tell companies, hey, you can't violate the Constitution in the way you conduct business.
Right. Well, on the other hand, though, we'd like those companies to basically cater to Americans as far as as far as hiring people to do their work, and if they're going to sell the things to us. I mean, that's what's kind of you think about the complex level here. Is I think we all want that to happen, and that's been part of the whole trend of globalism versus nationalism too. So, but then and I think about a local level. It's I don't think someone should discriminate against a black person versus a white person when it comes to, I think it's good to have those laws in our country, but on the other hand, it's you can understand why if all of a sudden there's a bunch of people from one region of the country moving into another region of the country, you can imagine that's going to be a little difficult as far as are there going to be enough jobs to go around and things like this. So I think this is something that is always going to be very, very difficult for us to deal with. But we have a country that has a history And we have all of these different groups that don't necessarily see eye to eye and don't see themselves as one these days. And we have to deal with that. I mean, whether we're an empire or a nation or whatever, I mean, we have to work these things out, and it's going to be really hard.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go on. Keep going.
No, you're good. Well, that's the thing is, you're right. So we're talking about systemic racism, and we're talking about, big tech censorship. I think that in a sense, I could see something good coming out of the big tech censorship situation, in the sense of, hey, in the 60s we said, okay, businesses can't discriminate against you based on your immutable characteristics.
Yes.
Now let me chase a rabbit here on that. Being gay is not an immutable characteristic. Okay, you may have the attraction, but we're talking about when a baker says, I'm not going to bake a cake for that. What we're talking about is celebrating a behavior, right?
Right.
That's what the Bible condemns, is the behavior. Now, well, and it does condemn if you, Nathan, are lusting after other women besides your wife, the Bible condemns that, right? And if a man is lusting after another man, the Bible condemns is the behavior. Now, well, and it does condemn if you, Nathan, are lusting after other women besides your wife, the Bible condemns that, right? And if a man is lusting after another man, the Bible condemns that. We call that concupiscence.
Right.
But what we're talking about is behavior. We're not talking about immutable characteristics there. So let's just bracket that off for a second.
Very good.
Yeah. Talking about immutable characteristics. We've told businesses you can't discriminate against somebody based on immutable characteristics like being black. Okay, that's a violation of the Constitution. I think it's perfectly fair, in light of that great precedent, to say, okay, big tech companies, big social media platforms, you have to follow the Constitution as well. You cannot violate somebody's civil rights with your platform, namely their freedom of speech. This is, we talk about the market taking care of things. We're not talking about, even something as simple as, racist, Johnny Reb down in the South, not letting a black man come in and get his hair cut in his barbershop. That guy's just going to go out of business. We're talking about gigantic companies who have established themselves in the market, and now they want to flip the switch. Now they want to discriminate. And I think we can come in and say, no, let's not do that. But that's how I understand systemic racism. However, I've been told that we still have systemic racism in the United States, and I cannot see this. Please enlighten me, friend. Show me where we have systemic racism in this country.
Well, I think it's particularly confusing for a lot of people, and I too have read the tweets about, hey, do the work yourself, and I'm exhausted, and don't talk to me about these things. Find out yourself who to read, and I just I look at that stuff and I'm like, okay, I want to sympathize, but on the other hand, it's like, yeah, I have read a lot of those guys you're talking about, and I've listened to a ton of stuff on YouTube, and it's just the kind of stuff I do. I'm very curious, and especially when it comes to hot button issues in our culture and like what's going on and how to handle these problems. I want to examine that stuff. So I have looked at it. But, historically, racism has basically been understood as like, a hatred of the other based on their skin color or their immutable characteristics, as you put it, or this belief in the inferiority or the superiority of one group over the other. And that's not, it seems, when people, so when people talk about systemic racism, I agree with you. Jim Crow seemed to certainly have that going on there, and certainly in the pre-slavery or the pre-Civil War days, that certainly seemed to be going on there in the country, particularly in the South. But the whole idea of systemic sin, it makes a lot of sense to me in a lot of ways, because I could say that, yes, we have a problem with systemic sin in America when it comes to something like abortion. We have a problem in America with systemic sin when it comes to something like living with one another before marriage. That's sin. The marriage bed is to be kept pure. And that is something that God has desired for each and every man and woman. So when I hear systemic racism, I think, okay, so that means that there's this belief that, some people are inferior than others, or some groups are inferior than others, and some are superior, and that is certainly going to pan out in the way that we treat one another. But that doesn't seem to be what is going on with most people's understanding of systemic racism. So you look at someone like Ibram X. Kendi, whose book right now, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is very popular. And he is basically saying that if there is a disparity in outcomes, if there is an inequity when it comes to different outcomes, for example, if more black people are being charged with murder, arrested, charged with murder, jailed, that kind of a thing, that this shows that ultimately there is a systemic problem with racism. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with any hatreds or belief in inferiority or superiority, but all it has to do is with bad policies. So you've got policies that are bad, and that is the main reason. And they're systemic. They're all over the place. They're built into the structure of our country. And so that's why we have any problem that we have, basically. And so you're an anti-racist if you fight for good policies. And that might even mean reverse discrimination. And you're racist if you want to kind of uphold the status quo, regardless of what those laws say, I guess. I mean, those laws don't have to be explicitly racist. In the sense, the traditional sense of racism, hatred of the other, inferiority or superiority, and this playing out in a variety of different rules and regulations that would keep people down based on those beliefs. Does that help?
Yes. I think if what you're saying is, so you mentioned Kendi, and I wonder if he's trying to make the turn toward what I could only phrase as black nationalism a lot more subtly than your traditional black nationalists. So, take Eldridge Cleaver, for instance. There's a famous, I don't know if I sent this to you, you ought to watch it though, but he was on Firing Line with William Buckley back in the day. You ought to watch that. It's pretty astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, you did send me the clip, but I'm trying to remember specifically the content of it. So share
that. Right. So, you don't have to. I mean, you just imagine, the Black Panther movement in the '60s. They weren't hiding the ball at all.
Right.
They were
and refreshingly direct.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Cleaver was perfectly clear in saying, it's our turn to be the oppressors. That's the only way this is going to get solved.
Right.
And what we're gonna do is we're gonna take all of the wealth you've accumulated on our backs, and we're gonna take all that, redistribute it among ourselves in a socialistic way, and we're gonna rule you for a few hundred years. That's how it's gonna go.
Yeah.
And so, they weren't hiding the ball. But then you've got folks like, the one I think of is James Cone, the Black Liberation Theology movement, where Cone was like, no, this isn't the way to go. You can't, in so many words. And this is what the Liberation Theology movement, their brilliant move, I think, and I'm not being facetious there or sarcastic. They were very intelligent in saying you can't just come right out with this stuff. You've got to use deception in order to get enact this situation.
Correct.
Where we can have the black nationalistic situation. So that podcast you sent me from Premier Christian Radio, unbelievable,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
Where the gentleman from Jamaica, and his name escapes me at the moment, but he was talking about how, no, we're not looking to integrate, really.
Yeah. True.
Church-wise.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
even if you are a black person in a traditionally white church, and this is in the UK, what you should do is caucus off, silo off, get away from the white people,
Sure.
and build up your power, and that way you can come to the table with some demands at some point.
Sure.
It's white supremacy turned on its head. This is essentially what it is.
Right. Well, obviously, if the majority group, but particularly if white people did that and said that they wanted to do that in their churches, yeah, that would be very much frowned upon, to say the least.
Right. And so, however, that's where all these subtleties kind of come in, where you start talking about things like, you and I, Nathan, can be racist because we're white males, especially since we're Christians. We can be racist because we have the power. And
right.
what needs to happen, and the reason what that gentleman said on that podcast isn't racist is because they don't have the power. And what they need to do is they need to be able to get together as a people and eventually end up with the power. Right? Mm-hmm. That's the whole foundation, as near as I can understand it, of critical theory and neo-Marxism, which the whole thing is just a power struggle, right? I know this is kind of the old straw, but go ahead. Let me let you in there.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that, yeah, I can certainly see where you're coming with about this stuff. Now, first of all, someone like Kendi, I've heard, and I have not read his book. So I have listened to him speak. I have listened to others speak about him. I've read other articles I've seen online. I haven't gotten to his book yet. But I do understand that he does not use the equation that racism is prejudice plus power. And he does not deny that minority groups can be racist either. So he's trying to, but even so, you could see how someone like Kendi, with the direction that he's moving, by saying that it's really only racist policies that are the problem. And a racist policy is anything that results in an inequity. Okay, so, and where personal responsibility, where personal agency comes in here, it's a little bit difficult to say. That's really not his focus. That's really not the way that his system is constructed. So he is going, so that's complicated, but you could see how he could be useful to someone like, the Black Panthers and how they could work with him, right? Yeah. Now, as far as the congregations and that gentleman from Jamaica who was on Unbelievable with Justin Briley, I think. So it's a British Christian radio program.
See, and right there, that's your racism coming out right there. We can remember Justin Briley's name, but we can't remember the black guy's name.
Oh, well, yeah, true enough. Well, but, okay, yeah. Well, and maybe, in some cases, look, and here's where I would say, look, this is, maybe you shouldn't accuse people of racism on that so quickly, but talk about in-group preference. I mean, honestly,
something.
And even this kind of goes across races or different groups. They sometimes have a hard time. It's more difficult when you're not as familiar with people and you're not around them all the time. Now, Justin Briley, I've been listening to this show off and on for 5 years, so that's my excuse, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, is that? Oh, yeah. That's weak. That's weak, brother. You're telling me just because you've been listening to this cat for so long, that's why you remember his name. No. No. Just admit it. It's your racism.
Okay. Well,
anyway, I'm sorry. There I go.
See what you're talking about, like people in those churches building up their power and everything. But I think a lot of it also might have to do with, people just simply wanting to be around others who speak their language, who know their culture, who they don't always have to feel on guard with. They can let their hair down and kind of be who they are, it's like I don't think there's something necessarily wrong. And I actually, in my article that I wrote about reaching out to ethnic minorities, which is kind of what I based my response to that those unbelievable programs on in my blog too. I mean, I talk about like how I don't necessarily see anything wrong with ethnic churches in the regards of like them, like if they're not doing vigorous outreach, if they're not doing vigorous outreach to other groups. I don't think that that's something that should be condemned by any means. Now, however, if somebody from another group comes into their church and wants to like worship and become a member of that congregation because maybe they live in that area, nobody should be rejected because this is the Christian church, and we bring together people from all different groups, tribes, tongues. So anyway, I don't necessarily see all of that as like necessarily focused on like let's build up our power so that politically we can make an impact and get our demands met in the culture that we're living. But I can understand, like what you're saying about that too. I think it kind of goes both ways there, and so that just points to how complicated all of this can really be. But I don't have a problem with the Korean Presbyterian Church a few blocks down the street, and they're mostly homogeneous or whatever. I think that's great, and especially in America. And I've also written in that article, especially in America, there's a guy from National Review who wrote a book called Melting Pot or Civil War, and he's talking about the importance of assimilation, naturalization, when it comes to a topic like immigration. Now, many people today will say if a person comes into a country and you don't really want them there, that you're a racist or you're a total xenophobe. Well, this is kind of bizarre because historically every nation that's kind of wanted to retain its character, to retain its culture, they've all been concerned about assimilation. When you're in Rome, do as the Romans do. So right. I think that's a sound thing. I can't understand why that would be bad. Like if I invite you into my house and you start to just take over my house and start to change all the policies of my house, when you're staying with me, I mean, that's kind of a problem. I'd be like, Matthew, could you please leave now? And so like when it comes to like separating the two or distinguishing between the two kingdoms, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to have a limited immigration policy. But then you can see how these ethnic churches could be really helpful to people too, because I don't even think having all these different groups who are coming from different nations living in America and then living together was like, well, sometimes they can kind of create their own little ethnic ghettos, and maybe there's some charm to that. That's a good thing in some ways. We got Chinatown. I like to go visit Chinatown. I like to eat at Chinatown. But on the other hand, that can also work against assimilation and naturalization, which is seen as a horrible thing by many people today. Well, why not just let them at least be able to meet in their, in their churches and to kind of be able to come together and let their hair down with one another and be in the presence of the Lord together. I think that's kind of a beautiful thing. So anyway, I know I'm going in a different direction than what you wanted to go, but I see all of these questions and problems as being connected, and I don't feel like anybody really thinks about. I shouldn't say that. I mean, it's like it just seems so often that kind of like these bigger picture issues and how they all tie together is kind of missing in the ways a lot of people analyze and evaluate things here.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned things being complicated, right? Hang on a second. Let me see something here.
To be sure.
Make sure I have my. Okay. Just wanted to make sure my phone and my computer aren't recording Skype at the same time. So it's complicated. I agree. Those videos you sent me were just yesterday. That video and the article you sent me were very helpful.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're talking about slavery, and one book I'd recommend to you is, I can't remember the full title. It's one of Tom Sowell's books. And the first part of the title is Black Rednecks.
Right.
And I can't remember the rest of it. Black Rednecks and White something. Can't remember. Anyway, And if you're so inclined, the full audiobook is on YouTube. Anyway, he details the Atlantic slave trade, much like that BBC article. More, it was kind of a microcosm of the Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, the biggest slave traders, according to Soule in that book, are what you would term the Arabic nations of that time. They were really into that. They were shipping people back and forth and in and out, and now they didn't have to go as far, but at the same time, one of the most, like what was pointed out in that article, one of the most brutal part of the trips was when they would go out, in the bush and round you up, and you had to walk 300 miles chained to another person. 10-15% of the people died just right there. Forget about making the trip by ship over to the Western world. That was the particularly brutal part of that sort of thing. But we see that everybody was participating. I mean, slavery was the rule of the day, just like that video showed in Roman times. That was just normal. You had the ruling class and you had the slave class. That's just how things were. And until some idiot thought it would be a good idea to say something like, we have these rights that are given to us by God, and we say because of that, all men are created equal. Some moron came around and said something like that, and then based on that, we decided that slavery isn't such a good idea, and in fact, it might be immoral, unbiblical, in fact.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's a recent phenomenon, and now we're. So what struck me about that article and that video is up until 5 minutes ago, really, and you're talking about human history, up until about 5 minutes ago, master and slave was just, you didn't even question that. Conquest, how do you get more power? How do you get more resources? You get your army together and you go take over this country.
Right, and you commit genocide against this or that people, and you don't feel any need to justify it, and that's Absolutely. the way it was in Rome. So, and when you want to talk about slavery has been endemic in world history, and you want to talk reparations. It looks like almost every nation in the world needs to be paying reparations, particularly the Middle East, particularly Brazil. Of course, everyone's focused on America right now and its evils. I wonder if envy has much to do with that. I mean, look, I know there's been a lot of terrible things going on in our history, but there's also, as we've talked before, I think about matters too. Maybe reparations. Well, I wouldn't say maybe. I'd say seems to me it would have been a good idea to have the things that they were talking about after the Civil War go down, but it's 150 years later. I think the whole idea of a statute of limitations is a totally reasonable argument here, because where does it end, right? And as far as Rome and the thing about slavery, one thing I find really interesting too is that the early Christians, I mean, they had to deal with, Matthew, they had to deal with the epistles, of course, of the Apostle Paul. And there is the book of Philemon. There is the passage about not selling yourself into slavery. But, if you can get your freedom, do so. But then Paul said a lot of other really things that make us pretty uncomfortable still, and we're not able to deal with. And one thing I will just simply assert is that in the Garden of Eden, we were all brothers and sisters. I don't think there was any slavery. But, in the Old Testament, God certainly allowed for it. Some people want to say, wait, he regulated it. This was like concessions for hard hearts. Okay, I understand that. But nowhere did he say, this is like a sinful thing. He talked about particularly freeing slaves of fellow Hebrews and things like that. But there's still a lot of things in the Old Testament that I read them and I'm still like, wow. I don't know if I can deal with this. And I just feel like a lot of people in America I don't feel like we can really deal with it. And you look at what did the early Christians do? They did fight slavery. I mean, first of all, you have everybody coming to the communion table together. Second of all, you have all these stories about Christians who, what did they do? Did they start a revolution? Did they overturn the governments of their time in order to free the slaves? You know, was it just like, were they taking the place of God and doing an exodus here and there around the world? No, what were they doing? They were buying slaves. They were, can you believe it? They had the nerve to compensate those masters. I just think that's horrible. I mean, really, it's like, as an American, you're just like, how can you compensate the masters? Hey, you want to talk about how silence is violence? Let's take it up a few levels. What about buying the slaves from the masters and compensating them for their evil? It's like, well, what did those early Christians do? They bought all these slaves. And, what did a lot of the people in the South who weren't too thrilled about slavery, what did they do? They bought a lot of slaves too. And they freed them and stuff like that. But today we want revolution. We want blood now. And I think that God's way, as uncomfortable as it makes us feel, I think we really do need to talk more about the kingdom of God. We need to focus on forgiveness and mercy. We need to talk about the gospel, how all people, we're all one blood. We've all sinned. We all fall short of the glory of God. Jesus Christ forgives us. He makes a way of peace between us. We can forgive those who've done wrong to us. Yes, there's time. There's a place to talk about restitution. There's a place to talk about, setting up laws to help the poor, and how that is, maybe that is our duty, especially to take care of our own brothers, but even beyond our own brothers in the cities that we live, sure. But where does the focus need to be? I mean, I think the focus really needs to be on the gospel of Jesus Christ and how we are now not only slaves of the greatest master that we could possibly imagine, but we're also his brothers, his friends, and all one another. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, so let me play devil's advocate a little bit here. So you mentioned the gospel, and I'm all for the gospel, for the forgiveness of sins, but the Bible is clear. You mentioned making restitution, and the way you're thinking, Nathan, is very Western, very American. You're thinking in very individualistic, and I would say hyper individualistic terms.
Okay.
Because the way Holy Scripture speaks is one group who has offended another group making that restitution. So how can we, as whites, as being born into privilege, as it were, make restitution to those who we've oppressed for so many years? What's that we biblically we have to do that, don't we?
Well, first of all, what you're doing is you're making this all about racial groups, and the Bible talks about race. Paul talks about race. He says that he has great pain over the situation with his own race because they've rejected the Messiah. But in the Bible, the word race, it doesn't really mean what we mean, because we seem to mean that, all these immutable characteristics, and we're white and we're black and whatever other races you want to talk about. But then you've got situations of parents you've got mixed race marriages, and you've got fraternal twins, and one of them, lo and behold, is black. One of them is white. I guess parents can have children of different races. Doesn't really seem to make much sense, but they have the same ethnicity. They have the same, they got the same parents. So right. They've got to be in the same ethnic group. They've got to have the same culture. And these are the things that, like, when the Bible talks about race, that's what it's talking about more. It's not talking about dividing up the world into 5 races. I mean, it's talking about different groups that have come about through the union of a man and a woman, and this tribe and that tribe, and people marrying among the tribes. And Of course, in world history, the way that usually happened, and we have new ethnicities formed, I'm afraid to say it looks like conquest, killing all the men, terrible things happening. But I don't necessarily know if it's always been like that. I don't think it has to be. So when you talk about that, I would just say, like, what Bible passages are you talking about specifically when you talk about like one group doing restitution to another? I mean, I don't deny that there is corporate sin. There's real generational corruption that happens, that continues. Of course, we know that the sins of the fathers are not passed down to the sins of the son. That's made very clear in Ezekiel in particular. And yes, that doesn't mean you won't have the sins passed down like through culture where you have generational corruption. And there's going to be generational consequences for the sins of the fathers. But this whole idea of generational guilt is not really a scriptural concept. And that's where, we have to have a statute of limitations just from a worldly perspective. But I'm not guilty of the sins of my ancestors. And then, of course, you have all these complications, right? I mean, who is a black American who is worthy of reparations in our country too? Because we have the American descendants of slaves, as they like to say today, which actually makes a lot of sense to me, to kind of make a distinction between those who were unwillingly brought over here, who are, kidnapped in their own countries, endured all those terrible things. And then, of course, people who recent African immigrants who come here. And then, of course, same thing with whites. I mean, it's like, whites, who are the Irish white? I mean, were the Scottish and were the Italians white? I mean, there was a time when, and this is the whole thing. We've got this complicated history in this country. We're going to pay the piper for our past sins, I'm afraid. I hope that we can overcome a lot of things through God's grace and mercy. But I mean, we did kind of create those categories in this country. And then scientific racism, bolstered by Darwin, made it all the worse. Where it just became this, because what is Darwin all about? Darwin is all about how life is struggle, life is death. And so what do you think is going to happen when that's the underlying foundation of how you view the origin of man and the origin of the races? It's like, good God. I mean, like, you think we need a different narrative? I do.
Yeah.
And I mean,
that would be helpful.
And I'm not saying that like, just ignore all evidence and shut your eyes to it. No, I think the evidence, for the biblical worldview and for the scriptures is overwhelming. I mean, of course, the gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. So, but nevertheless, the gospel does what it does, and it works like yeast going through the dough, and it's subtle. It's subtle, but none of us want subtlety today. We don't want the world to be changed and transformed by the forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ.
Well, I definitely want to circle back to that, but let me push you even further. So,
okay,
you're making excuses, Nathan.
Yeah,
those are just a bunch of excuses. So let's just skip over the excuses for a second. Let's say we get this all sorted out and we figure out who's white and who's black and who deserves reparations and what have you. I mean, I'm not smart enough to figure all these things out, but our country, our government should at least draw a panel together of very wise people, get them to sort all this out and figure out where we need to make restitution. All right? So let's just skip over all that, because you and I, obviously, we're laymen. We're not smart enough to figure any of that out. We'll let the experts figure that out. But once they figure that out, let's say we find out, okay, these people, this certain group of people certainly deserves some sort of reparations. What now step out of the layman category and go into policymaker. What reparations should we make? And now this is anachronistic, but I would suggest that once we identify this group that needs to have reparations, that there needs to be certainly monetary reparations. Reparations for real estate.
Right.
Reparations for education. So we should take the education piece. We should come up with some brilliant policy where more of this group of former slaves that had ancestors as slaves should be able to get into Harvard more readily, and the Ivy Leagues, and college in general. We should have some sort of program like that. We should also have some sort of program that dedicates a good chunk of our monetary resources toward these poor people that are the inheritors of this poverty because of this systemic racism dating back hundreds and hundreds of years.
Okay.
We should have a policy like that where we have monetary reparations.
All right.
That's what I think. We should do some programs like that. What do you think about that?
I'm actually not wholly opposed to, discussions about these things. I think there's something natural in human beings that cries out for restitution, cries out for justice. How that plays out in the world it's going to be different in this time and this place. Ultimately, we as Christians look to God as the ultimate justice maker. He's the one who's going to set things right, and that's kind of the orientation. That's kind of the attitude that I see in Scripture, where we read that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. So, and his vengeance is perfectly in his anger, his vengeance is perfectly in line with what is good and right, and what should be and what will be. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing, again, is, where does it end with reparations? You're opening up a can of worms here that says basically, I don't want the world to be based on, an understanding that, as that one famous quote puts it, realize what is it? Something about how everyone is, I can't think of the quote, but, it's like everybody is, struggling. Everyone's a human being. Anyway, it's like I understand the need for justice. I think justice needs to be timely. I think justice needs to deal with concrete circumstances of particular persons who have wronged others, and that we can't expect groups, especially races, to be able to come in and make perfect justice. I think that just is a way to tear the world apart, quite honessly. But
the hell you say?
Well, I think we're sending ourselves all to a hell on earth. But reparations. I don't know. What was your question? How did you put it?
So here's what I'm driving at with kind of
No. Ask me the question one more time. Hold on.
So I would suggest that once the experts get all this sorted out, and we've identified the group that deserves these reparations, this restitution, what do? I say they need more access to schools like Harvard, Princeton, the Ivy Leagues. They need monetary reparations, et cetera.
All right, now, okay, so I know what I wanted to say now. Okay. I think that if you are going to have a serious discussion about reparations, now is not the time. And I say that just because, we could talk about it here, probably preferably privately. But I just don't think it's the time, because I feel like right now there's so many people taking advantage of politics in this and that way. And we start talking about reparations now, and then people who are LGBTQ are going to be talking about reparations 5 years from now or earlier. All right, so we got that going on. Also, I just look back to what Martin Luther King Jr. said. Now, I know that Martin Luther King Jr. was not that a lot of his life, and I'm not talking about the morality things, a lot of his life has been kept from our eyes in terms of like his maybe what he actually did have more in common with the black nationalists, people like Malcolm X, okay? But on the other hand, Martin Luther King Jr. did say some choice things that are true and everybody loved, and really wrung. It really hit people in the heart, convicted people, and made them look at things in a different way, where he talked about how the content of a person's character. And Martin Luther King Jr., from what I have read in the black magazine, The Root even, they had an article there several years ago talking about how when Martin Luther King Jr. talked about reparations, how he was willing to kind of be merciful and willing to be compassionate and willing to try to bring things about, to bring restitution about in a way that retained the dignity of those whom he was asking for restitution from. And so really a lot of the legislation that happened during the civil rights movement, 1965, the voting thing, the thing about redlining, all of these things, and then plus, the Great Society programs, all of this stuff, these are things that Martin Luther King Jr. saw is going hand in hand with restitution, with reparations even, and he was even willing to include, for example, white veterans who had not been treated as well as they should have by the government. And so he didn't see, and so what happened is reparations and restitution, it became something that benefited the black community, but it also was generous. It was generous to other minorities. It was generous to other people who had been unfairly treated and oppressed. And so, yes, I know that, that's not the whole story. I know that he had things in common with Malcolm X. And yet at the same time, he said that kind of stuff too. And I don't know if that was something that he went back on later on in his life as he kind of became more sympathetic to communism, as James Cone said in 1984, and was even beginning to see himself as becoming a communist. I think I can say that now, right? Because being a communist is cool now, right?
Yeah.
So like before, you couldn't really say that because that would be slandering Martin Luther King Jr. But now I guess it's okay.